Welcome to JonGetsGames. Today, I'll be reviewing Arboretum. This is a deceptively simple and somewhat intense card game about planting beautiful trees into paths and then defending your right to score them. First, I'll go over the rules, and then I'll jump into my review. Arboretum consists of a big deck of cards with 10 different suits inside, each ranging from 1 to 8 in value. Setting up the game is quite easy. If it's a 2-player game, you remove 4 suits from the deck. It doesn't matter which ones. If you're playing a 3-player game, you only remove 2 suits from the deck. And if it's a 4-player game, you just play with every single card in the game. And now you deal out 7 cards to every player, and you flip up 1 face-up discard pile per player. So this right here would be a setup for a 2-player game. The first thing you do on a turn is you draw 2 cards. Now you either draw these from the face-down draw deck or from any face-up discard piles. You can draw from your own discard pile, and you can draw from the same discard pile multiple times. In this instance, I'd probably draw this 8 because I started off with the 1, 4, and 5, and then I only have 1 of these royal poinsettias, so I'll probably grab a random one from the top of the deck, and oh, I got another one. Once you've drawn 2 cards, you will always have 9 cards in your hand. At this point, you need to play one of these cards face up in front of you into your Arboretum. For instance, I might take this one here, put it right here in the middle, and this has begun what will end up being a very large Arboretum. The last thing you do on every turn is discard one of your cards face up into your own personal discard pile. In this instance, I might go ahead and look at my hand and say, at this point, this oak isn't doing much for me, so I discard it down here. I'm once again down to 7 cards, and now it's the player to my left's turn. One thing I'd like to note about discarding is that the rules just say you discard a card onto the top of your discard pile. What we have adopted doing is discarding cards in a splayed order so that you can always see every card that was underneath it. Now, I don't think that this is necessarily the way the game was supposed to be played, but we enjoy it because it takes out the memory aspect of what cards have been discarded into piles before, and we get to kind of math things out. But that's not necessarily how the game is hypothetically supposed to be played. I can't be sure about that. Players will keep taking turns until the entire draw deck runs out. Once the final card is drawn, that player will evaluate their full turn, and then the game will be over. Now I'm going to jump into an extended look at how we actually build our Arboretum and the reasons we build it in that way. Now let's talk about this Arboretum, because it really is the meat of the game. You start the game by placing any card in the central area right in front of you. It can be any card in the deck. I happen to have picked this one of Magnolia here. Future cards must be played orthogonally adjacent to any of the cards that have already been played inside of your Arboretum. However, there are no actual placement rules in the game. Any card can be placed next to any other card in your Arboretum. The only thing that's going to modify how you're going to want to do this is the endgame scoring, which I'll get into now. At the end of the game, you may have an Arboretum that looks something like this. Of course, it could look completely different. It all depends on how you decided to play your cards throughout the game. It could be a big line or a zigzag or just a big old grid, but let's go ahead and use this as our example. What we're looking for are paths of trees. And simply defined, this is a set of cards that are all orthogonally adjacent to each other that ascend in numerical value and begin and end with the same type of tree. For instance, we have a jacaranda path here. We start with a 1, then we go 3, 4, 5, 7, and 8. So this is legal. We have ascending numerical value going through the whole path. We begin and end with the same type of tree. It doesn't actually matter what the tree colors are in between. You're not allowed to have duplicate numbers in a path, however, so we do not have a willow path over here because it goes 3, 3, 4, so this is not a path at all. And obviously, if you only have a single card of a tree, there's no way to make a path with that card, so you will be doing no scoring for that specific type of tree. So now let's see how we score a path. You get 1 point per card in a path, so we would get 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6 points for this jacaranda path. However, if you have a 1 in a path, then you get a bonus of 1 point. And if you have an 8 in the path, you also get a bonus of 2 points. That means this is 6 plus 1 plus 2, or a 9-point path. Likewise, with this dogwood path, we see that there aren't any trees in between these 2 cards, but that's fine. This is a 2-card path, and since we have an 8 card in it, that's a bonus of 2 points, so that's 2 plus 2, or 4-point path for dogwood. Now you are allowed to make paths that are all the same type of tree. In fact, you get a bonus if the path is at least 4 long and they're all the same suit. In this case, you get 2 points per tree instead of the usual 1. So for instance, this would be 2, 4, 6, 8 points, plus a single bonus point because you have a 1 in the path, so this is also a 9-point path. And lastly, we see this royal poinsettia path is 3, 4, 5, 7. That's fine. You can reuse cards when you're scoring different paths, so even though these cards are used in the jacaranda path, they can be used again for this royal poinsettia path. Not everybody gets to score every one of their paths in their Arboretum, however. Let's talk about how we get the privilege of scoring these specific paths for these different trees. At the end of every single turn and the end of the game, you will always have 7 cards in your hand, and these are going to be the key to scoring the different paths in your area. At the end of the game, we will go through every single type of tree and see who has the majority of points in their hand for that specific type. What I mean is, if we were to call out Jacaranda, every single player would take all of the Jacaranda cards out of their hand and put them face up on the table. You add up the value of all the cards that you played face up, so in this case, that'd be 8, and the player who has the highest value for that specific suit is going to be the only person who gets to score a Jacaranda path. Ties are friendly, however, so multiple people may be able to score a specific type of tree. So in this instance, I have 8 power going towards Jacaranda. An opponent could play a single card like this, and that's 7 power. However, 8 beats 7, and now I'm going to be able to score my 9-point Jacaranda path, and I'm going to log that down. Next up, if we were to call Oak, I would pull all the Oak cards out in my hand, which would be just this one, and let's say an opponent pulled these 2 out here. Well, my 8 still beats their 7, and even though I don't actually have a legal Oak path, I just have this single card, that's fine. I've stopped anybody else from scoring their Oak paths in their Arboretums, so in this case, everybody would get 0, and I'd be pretty happy about that. The last thing to note is what happens when a 1 and an 8 are both revealed when you're looking at the power of different suits. So in this case, if we called Royal Poinciana, I would have this 1 and 6, which would be 7. If an opponent played this 8, it looks like I'm in trouble. 8 beats 7, and I really want to score this path. However, if the 1 and the 8 both come out in the same reveal session to see who wins, the 1 will trump the 8 and knock it out of the game entirely. In this case, I'm going to win with 7. That 8 did nothing, and I'm pretty happy about it. So obviously, this is one big reason that you want to keep 1s in your hand. The game comes with a nice big score pad, which helps you out by letting you log all the different types of trees, write your scores down, you add them all up, and whoever has the most points is the winner. If the game ends in a tie, then the person who has the most different colored trees present in their Arboretum is going to win that tie, and if there is still a tie, then the rules say that both players must go out and plant a tree. After 5 years, whoever's tree is higher is going to be the ultimate winner of that particular game of Arboretum. For my review of Arboretum, I'm going to touch on each item in this list, starting at the top and working my way down to the bottom. So let's begin with those positives. And the first of these has to do with building that Arboretum in front of you. You need to think about what card are you playing, as well as where do you play it and when do you decide to play it. These are all very important aspects that go into building that little tableau in front of you. Now, there's almost a feeling of push your luck because you only ever have 9 cards in your hand when you're going to be playing these cards down. You, of course, go back down to 7 at the end of your turn. So you have a very small amount of information, especially early game, with which to decide, well, I have 3 Magnolia, I'm going to start putting Magnolia down, try to make a path, and then keep one of these cards in my hand to try and be strong in Magnolia at the end of the game. But the end of the game is way off, so in the meantime, I'm hoping to maybe pick up a couple Magnolia cards that people might discard, thinking that maybe you don't have necessarily a big thing going on just yet, or you just draw from the top of the deck and really hope to grab those good Magnolia cards. Of course, you could get lucky and start off with like 5 Magnolia cards in your hand, and that means you're going to be strong on that path, but that means you have very little information and strength in any of the other types of trees. And I've never seen anybody win this game with only a single big scoring path. You need at least 2 paths to score. If one of those is big, then you can win with 2. Usually people win by getting 3 different paths scored into their Arboretum. In addition to that push your luck idea where you're hoping that things are going to work out in the future, there's also just the puzzle of how you place your cards so that you can get multi-use through them. You know, maybe you run the 2, 3, 4, and then you run something else back through that 3 again to try and get multiple scoring potential possibilities through single cards. You don't necessarily want to just build rows of cards that are each only giving you 1 opportunity to score. You really want to synergize this stuff as much as you can given the small amount of information that you have in your hand and what you can see out in front of you. When you add these 2 things together, it just makes for a wonderful decision every single turn. How are you going to place that 1 card into your area and all the ramifications that are involved? I haven't found that analysis paralysis is too bad with this. There is a possibility to really lock down on that a bit, but you can think about it when it's not your turn. You can see the cards that other people are playing and discarding. So in general, it has not been too much of a problem as far as downtime is concerned. It's just a really tasty decision. Positive number 2 has to do with how difficult and layered the decision to discard a single card from your hand can be, usually as you're playing the game. the first thing you're constantly thinking about is, I don't want to get rid of any of these cards. You usually find yourself in a situation where you like everything in your hand for various reasons. Either you want to play it out in front of you to make a stronger path, or you want to keep it in your hand so that you have a much better chance of scoring that path at the end of the game. Or maybe you just have one or two really strong cards of a different color that you already see an opponent going big on, and you want to keep those in your hand to potentially play them at the very end of the game to stop them from scoring anything. On top of that, you really don't want to discard those cards because they're very good for your opponents, but at the end of the day, you have to discard a card from your hand. You're going to eliminate every single card from your hand as a potential to discard and then realize, well, let's re-look at this again and decide what I'm actually going to get rid of. Now, every now and then, there is an easy discard, but I would say that's 1 out of every 10 hands is a simple decision. Those other 9 are really great things that you have to think about all the different ramifications. You might discard a card that's really good for the person directly to your right, and you just hope that the other players before you might pull it back into their hand because they see how good it is for them. I've had situations where I do that, somebody pulls it up into their hand, and then they start going big on that color as well. And so I thought I was helping this person, and in actuality, I was helping that person. At the end of the day, whatever you discard is probably going to help somebody, and that just makes it a great decision wrapped up into just this tiny little act of discarding a single card. Positive number 3 is specifically the hand majority mechanism at the very end of the game. Now, I already touched on this a little bit with discarding because it comes into play with what you want to discard. But just when you really think about how you're going to plan building your Arboretum based on the cards in your hand and the strength that you need to keep in your hand to just stay just above the threshold over everybody else and still get the most points out of that specific suit is really interesting. I like how you can have the ability to really count the cards. There's only 8 in each suit, so it's not too drastically hard to maybe see what other people have played, see a couple things in the discard pile, and based off your hand, and sometimes you can solve it and realize, I am actually totally good. I'll play this card and this card, and no matter what, I will be safe. Now, I think part of that is because we splay our discards out so that you can see every single card underneath it. And like I said in the rules overview, that's not something that's strictly forbidden by the rules, but it's not something that's ever mentioned in the rules. So it's a slight, maybe variant on how the game is hypothetically supposed to be played, but it's a way that we really enjoy playing it so that there is no memory element, because I really don't like it when memory is a big deal in a game, and based off of the cards that are discarded, memory would be quite a big deal to figure out the kind of strengths that you have in your hand based off of other people. And now other people are going to like that memory aspect, but we don't, so we get rid of that with splaying those cards, and it adds in to that great zero-sum nature where you can really figure out how you're going to keep the cards in your hand to best score the paths in your Arboretum. And positive number 4 is simple. The cards are beautiful. The artwork of each of these different trees is so intricate, and it just pops off the table. Every time this game is played, people come by and talk about how gorgeous it looks on the table, and they want to know more about how this weird tree game plays. In addition to that, just the linen of the cards, they feel really good in your hand. They have this foil kind of gold look to the back of the cards. It's just a really good combination of component quality. On top of all that, you have this big pad for scoring, and normally I don't like scoring pads, I kind of avoid them, but I've actually enjoyed it in this game, writing down all the different scores for the different trees, and now I have a log of how we've done in all previous games. And I think I'm going to continue using that pad and just keeping it in the box because it's kind of neat to see how things went in the past. Someone can say, well, how often is 3 trees 1 versus 2 when you're scoring in the end? And I can just flip through the score pad and look at it. I don't know, it's just neat. I think it's an amazing package for the money that you're going to pay to get this game. And now let's shift into the neutral points. The first of these has to do with the special scoring conditions for the 1 and the 8, not only on the table, but when they're coming from your hand at the end when you're trying to figure out majorities. Now, I think that these mechanics are important to the game. I think they add a lot to the game, but they also feel kind of inelegant. Like just having the 1 arbitrarily be a bonus point when it's in your Arboretum on a path, and the 8 gives 2 points. Well, I understand why that is, because you're going to want to keep 8s in your hand to have a really good buying power situation for winning to score a path. So if you put it in your path, you're sacrificing that potential, and so you should get paid out because of that. But it's not on the card anywhere on the 1 or the 8. There's no little iconography to kind of hammer that point home, and it just kind of feels, it's a little awkward every time I've taught it. And people have understood it. I haven't had too much of an issue with it, but every time I teach it, it's kind of a stumbling point where I have to kind of go over it twice. Not only that, but also the thing at the end where if somebody reveals the 1 and somebody else reveals the 8, the 1 kills the 8. again, I totally understand that. It makes the 1 a more interesting card to keep in your hand, and it makes the 8 more of a risky thing to keep in your hand if you haven't seen the 1 yet. I like all of that, but ultimately, these things come together to feel a little bit inelegant, especially when compared to the pure elegance of the other mechanics that make this game up with the drawing, placing, scoring rules. It works, but it feels a little awkward. A neutral number 2 has to do with expectations. When you first pick up this box and look at it, it's got this gorgeous filigree art. It's called Arboretum. That's about having a forest of trees. You look and you see this deck. It's full of gorgeously made tree cards. You think this is going to be a pleasant game. We're going to be playing these cards down. It's going to make pretty little paths. But in actuality, it's a pretty brutal game where you are making all these painful, arduous decisions. I've joked that the tagline for the game should be painful decisions and regret, because that discard is so hard, and 4 turns into the game, you're already going to be regretting how you put these cards into your Arboretum. It is nowhere near as peaceful and serene as a game called Arboretum might first lend you to believe, and I don't think that's a problem, but I think it can catch people off guard. They get like 4 turns in and they're like, wow, this is actually intense. Like, this is not an easy stroll through the Arboretum kind of game. This is a crunchy, really think about every single decision, because every single one of them is really important kind of game. And I don't think that the theme in the box art necessarily conveys that. And this is the point where I would normally discuss at least 1 negative point for the game. But for the first time in making reviews for my channel, I cannot come up with a single negative attribute for this game. Even those neutral things, they're just neutral. They are little skipping points, a little bit of awkwardness. They don't detract anything from the game, in my personal opinion. And I thought about putting this review off for a while until I played it more times to try to find a bad part of the game. But I played it 6 times now, and I think ultimately I'm not going to find an issue that really brings this game down for me. So unfortunately, I have no negative points, so let's move on to the next section. And that's going to be replayability. Obviously, with this game, there is very little variance between one play to the next. Every single card in the deck is going to be there every time you play. Sure, in 2 to 3 player games, you pull a couple suits out, but that's just a thematic, glossy difference. All the suits play the same, so you're going to be doing the same thing every time you play. You always draw 2 cards, you always play a card, you always discard a card throughout the entire game, but that has not detracted from a replayability perspective. I've played the game 6 times so far, and I'm really looking forward to playing it many, many more times, and I think that's just because the mechanisms work so well. It's so thinky, it's so interesting, but it also plays usually in about 20 to 40 minutes depending on your player count, and I think that makes it this awesome super filler that you can play at the beginning and middle of your game night at any point to really have a very fascinating, interesting game to think about. I see this game being played 20 times, 30 times by me, going well into the future, and it's not because each game is going to bring a new aspect. Like some games you bring things in and bring things out and you leave some stuff in the box. This game doesn't have that. It has a classic card feel. It really feels like a game that could be 40 years old, and I really like that. I think it just keeps you wanting to come back for more because the decisions themselves are so pure and so interesting. And also the fact that you don't build your Arboretum the exact same way every game lends itself to a very long amount of replayability. I think if you like the game the first time you play it, you're going to be still really enjoying it on the 20th game. And now let's discuss player count. Arboretum plays 2 to 4 players, and I've played all of those different types of the game. And I'd say the biggest dividing line comes between the 2 and 3 player game as far as how the game plays and differently. So the 3 to 4 player game, the biggest difference is that you have multiple people that you can help out as you're playing the game. Obviously, you don't want to help anybody out, but as you're discarding cards into your discard pile, you are going to inevitably be getting rid of good stuff for other players. And in 3 to 4 player games, you can give good stuff to various different people. You kind of spread out the love so you're not helping one particular person too much. Or you might look over and see the person who you think is the weakest and help them because they're not your biggest threat. Versus the 2 player game, you only have your opponent. So every time you play a card that will help your opponent, it always helps your only opponent. And it makes it much, much more difficult. Of course, you also have the thing to think about in the 2 player game of the zero-sum aspect where they're the only person who's going to have cards that could stop you from scoring a big path inside your area, versus in a 3 to 4 player game, there are multiple people who could potentially come in and try and mess you over with that. Ultimately, I think 2 player is brilliant. I love how back and forth it is. It's very quick to go. It's like a 20-minute game when you only play a 2 player game, but it's intense. You only have that one other person, and it really makes those discarding actions the hardest that this game really gives you. In the 3 to 4 player game, I think they both play really well as well. They're just a little bit nicer, and I don't know, it's fun to see all these different arboretums that happen around the table. If I was to pick a favorite, I would say that 3 is probably a touch better than 4, just because it's a slightly shorter game, and if you have anybody who is prone to analysis paralysis, they might take a little bit longer on their turns, and it takes a little bit longer to get around the table back to you. But I would say that 2 player and 3 player are different enough to be equally best in my book, but I will never say no to playing this game 4 players. In conclusion, Arboretum is one of the best card games that I've played in years, and it swiftly jumped up to become one of my favorite games in general. And it really all comes down to how interesting, important, and oftentimes arduous every decision is that you make in the game. When you think about it, you're going to make 4 decisions a turn. You're drawing a card, then you're drawing another card, playing a card, and discarding. And now usually drawing a card is not arduous, but it's certainly important because you can push your luck and go for random cards from the top of the deck, or you could give your opponents information and draw known cards from discard piles around you. It might be a no-brainer. Maybe it's a really good card that opponent gave up in an arduous manner and you take it because you know it's going to be good for you, but maybe you're taking a different color card that people weren't expecting, and now they saw you take that card, and now they're going to play around the fact that they know that you have that card in your hand. Then you add onto that the playing card phase, where you're really trying to puzzle together how all these trees and paths are going to work their way out, and also thinking about weighting the strength of that suit in your hand versus the strength of it in your Arboretum for scoring points. And finally, discarding a card is so painful, but it's that really great, interesting kind of painful decision where you don't want to get rid of anything, but you need to figure out the least good card in your hand and get rid of it and hope that it doesn't help an opponent too much. And then you add on to all of that the fact that this game plays great with 2, 3, and 4 players, as well as being a small 80-card deck. It makes this game highly portable and kind of an anytime, anywhere sort of experience. Now, I will admit that it is a pretty intense game. If you're looking for a laid back, like throw cards on the table, not really think about it too much sort of game, this is not going to be that. But what it will be is an enriching, in-depth, wonderful game that you'll be playing in only about 30 minutes. And I think that fits a great niche. And I see myself keeping this one around for a very long time. It's relatively easy to teach to new players. I will agree that there's a little bit of inelegant side rules that come in with the 1 and the 8, but I've never seen anybody struggle with that past certainly the first game, and usually people maybe ask once in the middle of the game and then nobody has questions by the time we actually start to score. So ultimately, this is a very strong endorsement for the game. If any of this has sounded interesting at all to you, I highly recommend that you seek it out, pick up a copy. I really don't think that you're going to be disappointed. I hope you've enjoyed this video. If you'd like to see more reviews like this one, as well as full game playthroughs, vlogs, and all the various other kind of videos I do, please consider subscribing to my YouTube channel. Thanks for watching.